Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction, more precisely about the critical situation that currently is taking place in Vovchansk. You know that now a lot of sources, either Ukrainian sources and the Russian sources, are talking a lot about the battle for Vovchansk. We have two different opposite opinions about the situation, two different, let's say, reports that we received from Ukrainian side and from the Russian side. And for example, according to the Ukrainian sources, the Russians are encircled in Vovchansk aggregate plant, and according to the Russians, everything is okay. The Russians continue offensive operation, and the Russians are capturing more and more buildings inside the aggregate plant. And of course, it's very difficult to understand who is lying and who is telling the truth. But today, Military Summary team made our own investigation about the situation of Volchansk, and we came to some very interesting conclusions about the situation, and now we'll give you our own opinion about the battle for aggregate plant, for the citadel, and for Volchansk itself. And to summarize, before we start, I would like to to make a small spoiler that both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, are telling the truth. So let's start from the beginning. Once again, the most important point we're going to talk about is Vovchansk aggregate plant, the most important stronghold in the north of Vovchansk, the stronghold that if you control the stronghold, then you control the main supply roads that goes to the Vovchansk citadel. This is Vovchansk citadel, and basically to the northern part. Who controls Vovchansk aggregate plants control the entire northern part. It's like the dune. Who controls the spice controls the universe. So when talking about northern Vovchansk, who control aggregate plans control the north of Volchansk. So what did happen and how we start talking, when we start talking, and why we start talking that the Russians were encircled by the Ukrainians? Let's build some chronology of the events that took place, that been taking place since the beginning of offensive operation, and let's first of all remind ourselves when exactly the Russians established control over Volchansk aggregate plant, or when did we receive the first reports about Russian control over the territory. If we increase the numbers of updates since the, let's say, 10th of May, when the Russians began their offensive operation, we're going to receive significant icons with the flags that tell us that the Russian control, let's say, icons or something like this. Let's go through them. For example, on the 20th of May of 2023, so almost months ago, the Syriac reported that the Russians captured the aggregate plant and the Russians established complete control over the southern part of, let's say, northern Vovchansk. That was reported on the 20th of May, so almost months ago. We got another report from pro-Russian sources that was published on the 21st of May, and also the Russian armed forces completely liberated the northern part of Vovchansk, therefore forcing the Ukrainians to go beyond the Vovcha river. So to summarize everything, we see that according to pro-Russian sources and neutral resources, the Russians entered aggregate plant on the 20th of May, so almost a month ago. But later, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps, showing that Vovchansk aggregate plant wasn't captured, and they made those, let's say, changes on my maps by mistake, so it was like mistakenly. But telling the truth, now we understand what exactly happened, and we will try to explain to you. Furthermore, the first military expert who reported about complete control over Vovchansk aggregate plant wasn't Syriac or any other pro-Russian resource. That was Rybar. Rybar reported that aggregate plant was captured somewhere around 20th of May, and based on his report, most of the mappers adjusted their maps. Now let's discuss very important post that was published today by the Ukrainian sources. The translation maybe is not so good because the translation was made from the Ukrainian to Russian and from Russian to English, but to summarize the post, we can make a conclusion that it was correct. Yes, it was correct and real information that the Russians captured Vovchansk aggregate plant on the 20th of May. The area was captured by the Russians. So what did happen? You know, when the Russians began Kharkiv offensive operation on the 10th of May, the Russians faced no resistance from the Ukrainian side fight in Plitenovka, there were no resistance in Gatishina, so there were no resistance along the border. The first resistance the Ukrainians shown the Russians just inside of the village, inside of the town. And while the Ukrainians were disorganized, while the Ukrainians didn't have enough of forces, while the Ukrainians didn't have enough of manpower in this direction, during the first phase of Kharkiv offensive, the Russians decided to make a very interesting and tricky operation. They sent a special forces, Spetsnaz, VDV, very powerful, experienced group of forces, Marines, Spetsnaz, I don't know how to call them, let's say the best ever forces ever in Russian army. They sent a small group of these guys right exactly to Vovchansk aggregatny plant. And the Russians bypassed significant territory of Vovchansk that at that moment was either under Ukrainian control or in the gray zone, while the Ukrainians didn't have enough of forces to protect every single square kilometer, maybe during the night, maybe using helicopters, maybe I don't know what, but the Russians bypassed significant territories and landed their forces inside of this aggregatny plant, and that event took place exactly on the 20th of May or somewhere around that date. So the Russians entered the aggregatny plant, the Russians captured significant number of buildings and started digging in deeper process. But the thing is that now we see that most of this territory in the southern part of northern Vovchansk is colored with red. But since from 10th of May till 20th of May, this territory was either in the gray zone or under complete Ukrainian control. And this is the first thing that we're going to talk about. Ukrainian report that the Russians were encircled. Yes, this is a completely correct information. The Russians were encircled since the beginning of the moment when they entered this territory by the Ukrainians, but that wasn't made or done by the Ukrainians as a result of counterattack. That was made by the Russians for a reason. The Russians at the beginning of Vovchansk, northern Vovchansk battle, they understood that the most important in the northern part is to control the main supply roads. And as for main supply roads, there are three of them. This is the first supply road, this is the second supply road, and this is the third supply road. This is it. And at the beginning, the Russians understand if they cut these supply roads, the northern Vovchansk will collapse automatically or will be captured very fast. So that's why they landed their infantry inside the aggregate plant and started digging in deeper process. But by the time the Russians entered aggregate plant, the main Russian forces, the majority of Russian forces, let's call it something like this, were located, let's call it like this, to on the top left part from this red line. So the main Russian forces were located here, not here, not somewhere here or here. The Russian forces were located somewhere in the vicinity of the northern outskirts of this, let's say, this northern part of Vovchansk. And starting from the 10th or 20th of May till 16th of June, the Russians were doing just one thing. They were trying to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to connect these two footholds, the Russian mainland, of course, and Vovchansky aggregatny plant. So the main Russian forces were controlling the main supply roads, while the rest forces were moving very slowly, step by step, under very heavy Ukrainian fire, with the very heavy clashes with Ukrainians inside of the citadel. The Russians were moving to this in the southern direction with the purpose to connect these two footholds. And we got very interesting report from the Ukrainians who compare, let's say, day by day how the situation was developed. For example, the Ukrainians are saying that yes, around May 20, police officers established complete control over the passage to the plant through Gorky Park. So the Ukrainians, this is Gorky Park, this is it, and the Ukrainians established complete fire control with machine guns from the southern part of Vovchansk. So the Ukrainians basically established fire control and were trying to slow down and not to allow the Russians to redeploy reinforcements and reserves from the mainland to aggregatny plant. So that was the situation. And we have this report also confirmed by other Ukrainians that the Russians tried to break through this 3 streets every day. Let's say it's Gagarina Street and Shevchenko Street. Let's go to map. On map, this is, for example, Shevchenko Street. According to the Ukrainians, the Russians are trying to break through this street every single day to Vovchansk aggregatny plant. And this is Gagarina Street. This is another road that the Russians are trying to break through to enter the aggregatny zone. So the Russians are trying to break through the streets, but the problem is that the entire area around is opened, and they are noticed or they come across the nests of machine guns emplacements of the armed forces of Ukraine. So if the Russians are trying to break through, let's say, and to get to Vovchansky plant, let's say along Gagarina Street, so this one, the Ukrainians from, let's say, now southern part start attacking them with machine guns. If the Russians are trying to use this, let's say, street, it's Pushkina Street and Shevchenko Street, then Ukrainians from the northern part are starting attacking the Russians with machine guns. So both streets, both supply roads under complete Ukraine fire control. And that means the Russians during the previous days, since 20th of May till, let's say, 16th of June, were supported and supplied just using drones. The Russians use the Mavic to drop water, and at night they use large drones to bring munition, food, cigarettes, and many other things that the Russians can use to support their forces at some proper level to control and to hold their positions inside of the aggregatny plant. And now let's continue talks about the chronology. So by the 20th of May, the Ukrainians established complete fire control with machine guns over 2 positions. Then it is known for certain that on June the 1st, the machine gun, let's say, positions of Ukraine forces took control over the approaches. The Russians were delivering water and food with drones. It was completely confirmed by the 1st of June. On June 6th, the next Russian breakthrough into the factory took place, consisting of 5 soldiers. Only one got there. So by the 6th of June, 10 days ago, the Russians managed to, let's say, get as close as possible to Volchansk from the northwestern direction. So basically, the Russians approached this line. And now they were able to start sending additional forces, not by drones, by Mavic, by Baba Yaga, but to cross the streets and to send forces on the ground. And the Ukrainians are saying that the first attempt was 5 soldiers, but just one managed to get. The 4 soldiers of armed forces of Russian Federation, according to Ukrainians, lost their lives somewhere along these lines and these streets. Later, the Ukrainians are saying that on June 8th, so 2 days later, a group of 15 soldiers broke into the factory. So after 2 days after the first attempt, the Russians sent larger group in number of 15 soldiers, and those 15 soldiers haven't lost even a single soldier, managed to bring additional forces and reinforce the Russians inside of aggregatny plant. And according to the same Ukrainian post, by 13 or 14 of June, the entire personnel carrier with munition supply reinforcement entered Vovchansky, let's say, aggregatny plant. So as you can see, both sides are correct. The Russians at the beginning of battle for Vovchansk, it's something like Gostomel. You know that when we were talking about Kiev offensive operation at the beginning of the special military operation, there was a Gostomel operation when the Russians landed in the Gostomel airfield with the helicopters with Marines, and they were holding the area until the main forces arrived in this direction. And now we see the same. Of course, it's not Gostomel. The sizes are much lower and much smaller in comparison with Gostomel, but the logic and the principles and doctrine is the same. Russian paratroopers, Marines, I don't know who, entered Vovchansky aggregatny plant, and while the Russians were controlling the main supply roads here, the main Russian forces were moving to the south. And somewhere on the 6th of June, the first Russian forces entered the distance, more or less proper distance to start sending troopers on the ground. And since 6th of June till 14th of June, the Russians managed to improve their foothold so much, so now they're able to send not just infantry, drones with water, cigarettes or something like this, but already to send armored vehicles, personnel carriers, and maybe the Russians are about to start sending tanks inside of aggregatny plant. So now you understand what exactly is happening there. Of course, we're not saying that the battle for northern Vovchansk is already ended, that the Russians won everything. No, of course not, because the Ukrainians during the same period of time received permission to start bombing the Russians with the Western weapon, and this is exactly what they're doing. The Ukrainians are bombing the offensive Russian forces with guided bombs Unit 39, GBU 39, with MiG-29s probably, or maybe ground-to-ground launchers like HIMARS. The Ukrainians deal significant damage to the Russians. We don't know for sure the losses the Russians are suffering, but the Ukrainians are using this weapon massively. And also, right before we start making the video, we had additional updates about the situation in the vicinity of the citadel. As you can see, we have significant number of geolocations, and these geolocations confirm that Ukrainians currently are trying to counterattack the Russian forces. Mainly the forces of 71st Jaeger Brigade are involved in these counterattacks, and now the Ukrainians are trying not just to, let's say, to counterattack the Russians with the purpose to, let's say, restore control over aggregatny plant. No, this is not exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. Now the Ukrainians are trying to attack to the west, in the western direction. The Ukrainians from the citadel are moving to the west with the main purpose to establish complete control over this territory. So to summarize everything, the Ukrainians are trying to improve their positions just for 300 meters to the west, and if the Ukrainians are able to capture these intersections of different streets, they will cut the Russian forces in the southern part of the northern Vovchansk completely, and then this is going to be a real disaster, and then this is going to be a real cauldron that will lead to significant losses and casualties among the Russians. Of course, the Russians will do everything they can but not to allow the Ukrainians to complete this mission, and now this is the main area of clashes, not even in aggregate plant but a little bit to the northwest for the intersections of the streets that leads the main supply roads from the mainland to the southern part of the northern Volchansk. The next few days are the most important days when the entire destiny and the entire future of the northern Volchansk will be resolved, and everything is going to be very interesting, very interesting. Once again, both sides can finish the battle very soon. The Ukrainians need to capture this territory, just the Russians need to capture the aggregatny plant completely, and who does this faster will win the battle for northern Vovchansk, and after that the entire situation can be completely changed in someone's favor. So that's it about the northern and Kharkiv direction. Let's move further. Before we move, another important thing, we got another video from pro-Ukrainian sources of how they were filming the Russian fortifications and Russian engineering machine who were building different fortifications along the border. So regarding and despite the progress or absence of any progress in Volchansk, the Russians continue improving their positions because they understand that everything can go wrong and they need to be prepared and they need to be on the safe side if the Ukrainians can win the battle for Vovchansk and if the Ukrainians start counteroffensive. So they need to be prepared to meet them not on the territory of Russia, of course, but somewhere in the vicinity of between Pletionovka and Tikhaya. As for other directions, as usually the Russians are pushing. We got a lot of updates about the Russian progress in the vicinity of Sinkovka. The Russians are moving through the fields. We have report about the Russians clearing the territories to the west of Kislovka-Kotlarovka, but without any big changes on the ground from Kupiansk till almost, let's say, Siversk direction. And as for Siversk, we received significant number of geolocations of how the Russians continue clearing and FPV droning the Ukrainian positions along the railways. So it's like there are still a lot of job to do. The Russians first clearing the territory with drones, they start offensive operation. So here we can see the regular military routine. As for Chasiv Yar, the same story. The Russians are FPV droning the Ukrainians with drones, with significant number of drones, but without any attempts to attack and capture the territories. They control the situation. Most of the forces of armored forces of Ukraine were deployed to the north, so that's why the Russians feel pretty comfortable. They do what they can do, destroying and attacking the Ukrainian infantry and vehicles that were left in Chasiv Yar for defense. Very interesting updates we continue receiving from Avdiivka direction. According to different pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Novoalexandrovka. They captured additional 3 lines, as you can see, yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation that can confirm the Russian progress here or here, but anyway, we keep this territory as is to understand that maybe this is the real situation. The most important from Sokol direction is that the Russians continue offensive operation, and currently there is a very heavy clashes for the stronghold itself. The Russians began offensive operation. The Russians are storming this territory from the south and from the north. There are very heavy clashes. Let's say to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities for the deployment of forces, first the Russians established complete control over the main supply roads. The Russians were bombing heavily the railways, roads, and just regular roads that were heading to the stronghold, and Ukrainians were cut off completely, and most likely the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back under the Russian pressure. Also, we have reports that the Russians managed to encircle completely the Ukrainians inside of Yasnobrodovka. This is the current situation according to different mappers, and now the Ukrainians are no longer available to evacuate their forces from this small village. Of course, we're not talking about thousands of Ukrainians, but 200-300 are already encircled in Yasnobrodovka. Krasnohorivka, we got additional updates of Russian progress in the central part. We have adjusted the map. We have colored, as you can see, this central part, the area that is blinking right in front of your screens. The Russians, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russians all over the entire territory of Ukraine, including this part of Krasnohorivka. So, as you can see, based on this video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians captured few buildings in the last line of high-rise area. If you ask my opinion, I would say that most likely the Russians have already captured every single building that located to the south, to the bottom of this yellow-white line. We just updated the map just based on geolocation, but logically that everything is already under control. And if it's true, then the Ukrainians control just the low-rise building to the north, which is not a very big barrier for the Russians. They will capture this territory very fast. Also, would like to remind you that according to information we have, the Russians during the previous days managed to capture this territory as well. So everything, geolocations, everything tell us that the battle for the stronghold for Krasnohorivka is about to be finished if we summarize everything. Now let's move further. In the southern direction we have just small regular updates from different directions like counter-artillery duels. The Ukrainians suffer losses. The Ukrainians can't show any resistance to the Russians in artillery duels. South Donetsk direction, Vremivka tactical bridgehead, we don't have anything. We have additional updates from Gulay-Polye direction. The Russians continue bombing and fabbing the Ukrainian positions of 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade inside of Gulay-Polye, and this the second video in a row we received from this direction. Just to remind you that yesterday we got the video of how the Russians were bombing the same village. Let's increase the numbers of this since the beginning of the month. Yesterday we got the video probably from the same squad that the Russians destroyed the temporary position of 78 Battalion of 102nd Defense Brigade. This is 102nd Defense Brigade on the map. Their temporary position was destroyed as a result of FAB, and today we got another video almost of the same type. The Russians destroyed the temporary position of the same brigade, but a little bit in different part of the town. So all these videos confirms that the Russians are very interested to reduce the Ukrainian power in this area as much as possible. And today, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, they managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Zahirne. So this village to the south east of Myrna was captured, so which also confirms some Russian progress in direction of Gulay-Polye. I'm not telling you anything, but if summarize everything, we see that maybe the Russians also do have some plans to capture this stronghold and to try to cut the main supply roads that goes from Zaporozhye in the eastern direction. Who knows? About Kherson, nothing special, just regular activity. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.